There was a time when solitude was a virtue, a badge of honor. A man could walk into the woods with nothing but the sound of his own breath and the weight of his thoughts, and he'd come out either enlightened or insane, sometimes both. Fast forward to now. In the year of our collective overstimulation, people fear silence more than they fear death. Sit in a quiet room alone and watch how fast the hands start fidgeting, how quickly the phone comes out. You don't even realize that you're doing it. Your hand moves on its own like it's possessed, reaching for the algorithmic syringe to inject another dose of something, anything, just so long as it keeps you from feeling alone. The truth is that you don't know how to be alone anymore, and it's not your fault. Your brain's been rewired, hijacked, stolen out from under you by glowing screens, infinite scroll, and a digital culture that treats silence like a disease. In the old days, being alone was how people found themselves. Now, solitude is treated like a punishment. Go to your room. Think about what you did, you little shit. But there was a time when solitude wasn't just a necessity, it was the path to wisdom. Think about monks, hermits, the mad geniuses who locked themselves in rooms and emerged with the blueprints for new realities. Nietzsche, pacing through the Alps, alone with his thoughts, carving ideas into existence like a sculptor chipping away at marble. Thoreau, disappearing into the woods, trying to remember what it meant to be a human being instead of a machine. Kafka, writing by candlelight in a room so quiet he could hear the scratch of the pen over the sound of his own breathing. These people understood something that we've forgotten. If you never learn to be alone, you will never truly think for yourself. Now, let's talk about the other side of this. Because if solitude is a superpower, then our modern world is its kryptonite. We live in an era of forced connectivity. Not connection, connectivity. There's a difference. Connection is meaningful. Connectivity is compulsive. The moment you wake up, your phone is already whispering in your ear. Here's what's happening. Here's what you missed. Here's what people are saying. 1,000 digital hands reaching out and yanking you into the collective nervous breakdown that we call the internet. It is not a tool anymore, it is an addiction, and that is by design. The tech bros are tweaking algorithms to make sure that you never experience solitude again. Think about that. Think about the sheer amount of money and computing power being poured into one single goal, keeping your mind from ever being alone with itself. They figured out that the more you scroll, the more they make. And what keeps you scrolling is an endless conveyor belt of artificial dopamine spikes. New notifications, new posts, new updates, new crises, and new distractions. The result is that you never have to sit with your own thoughts again. Lucky you. And at first that feels like a gift, because let's be honest, most people's thoughts aren't pretty. Anxiety, regret, insecurity, the constant nagging fear that you're wasting your life. The digital world offers a way to drown all of that out, a way to never have to listen to yourself. But there is a cost, because if you never sit with your own thoughts, you never get past the noise. You never push through to something deeper. The monks and the madmen, the mystics and the geniuses, they knew this. You have to go through the discomfort of being alone before you can hear the truth that lives underneath it. And that's exactly what modern life is trying to keep you from doing. Let's do an experiment. Imagine this. I take your phone away. No laptop, no music, no TV, no books. Just you, sitting in a room. Nothing to do but think. How long do you last? Be honest. A minute? 5 minutes? An hour? Before the panic sets in? Before your brain starts clawing at the walls looking for an escape? Before you feel the overwhelming need to consume something just to fill the silence? That's what's been stolen from you. The ability to be alone. And it's not about distraction. It's not about scrolling away your free time. It's about control. If you never have time to think, to reflect, to examine your own beliefs, then your thoughts aren't really yours, are they? They're just an accumulation of whatever junk you've absorbed from the algorithmic sludge pit of digital culture. You think you have opinions, but what you really have is a playlist of downloaded takes regurgitated from whatever the internet has been feeding you. You think you have a personality, but what you really have is a curated brand. You think you know yourself, but what you really know is what culture tells you to be. If that doesn't terrify you, it should. Because the moment you can't be alone with your own mind, you've lost the only thing that actually belongs to you in this world. So what do? We reclaim solitude. Not loneliness, not isolation, solitude. The kind of alone time that builds you, not breaks you. The kind of silence that makes you stronger, not weaker. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to do that. We're going to talk about the thinkers, the mystics, the philosophers, the artists, the people who understood that solitude isn't something to be feared, but something to be mastered. We're going to talk about why modern life is so afraid of silence and why it's so important that you learn to embrace it. And most importantly, we're going to talk about how you can take back your own mind. Because if you don't learn how to be alone with your thoughts, someone else is going to do the thinking for you. And you already know who that someone is. All right, let's get started.
835.
Picture this, a man sitting alone in a room. No phone, no laptop, no background noise to fill the gaps. The only sound is the slow rhythm of his own breathing, the faint hum of existence just beneath the surface of his thoughts. And then, there it is, the creeping discomfort. Because the thing is that silence isn't silent. It has weight, it has a voice. And if you spent your entire life drowning it out, that voice isn't gentle. It doesn't introduce itself politely, it kicks the fucking door in and starts screaming at you. At first, it whispers, "What are you doing? You should be productive. You should be checking your email. You should be catching up on the news." And then it gets louder. "Why are you even here? What's the point of this?" And if you sit long enough, it screams, "Who are you when nobody is watching?" That's the question most people never get to. Because most people don't sit long enough. Solitude used to be something humans sought out. Now it's something we avoid like it's radioactive. It makes us fidget. It makes us reach for distraction. It makes us look at our hands like they belong to someone else. The problem isn't just that we've forgotten how to be alone, it's that we've forgotten why it matters. Once upon a time, solitude wasn't seen as isolation. It was seen as power. Look at any major religious or philosophical tradition, and you'll find the same pattern. The wisest figures, the prophets, the mystics, the sages, all of them took time to disappear, to step away from the noise, to go into the desert, into the mountains, into the wilderness, up their own asses, whatever else. Moses climbed a mountain and came back with commandments. Jesus went into the desert for 40 days and came back with clarity. Buddha sat beneath a tree in silence for 7 and walked away enlightened. Lao Tzu, the supposed founder of Taoism, literally left society behind and disappeared into a cave with just 1,200 words about Wu Wei, the art of effortless existence, left behind. Even the philosophers, the ones who didn't claim to hear from gods, understood that deep thought requires deep silence. Socrates was infamous for his long, quiet pauses in conversation. I like to do that myself sometimes, it amuses me. Those moments where he'd retreat inside himself before speaking. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in history, spent his nights alone writing down his thoughts in a personal journal that he never meant for the world to see, but that you can buy on every fucking Stoic bookshop going these days. Pascal, the same guy who said that humanity's problems come from not being able to sit alone in a room, was also the guy who wrote entire books about those moments of solitude. Think about that. Books about moments of solitude. This wasn't just getting away from people, this was about getting close to something else, something deeper, something more real. And yet, here we are in this world where the idea of sitting alone for more than 5 minutes feels like a prison sentence. What changed? The shift from solitude as a virtue to solitude as a punishment is one of the strangest transformations in human history. For most of civilization, spending time alone was seen as essential. I mean, I fucking love it. It wasn't just for monks and philosophers, it was for anyone who wanted to truly understand themselves. But at some point, something flipped. Instead of solitude being a sign of wisdom, it became a sign of failure. Think about the language that we use. We call people loners, as if being alone is a flaw, a sign that something's wrong with you. Or maybe like socially awkward. Preferring silence over small talk is a disease. I would much prefer standing in silence with someone than talking about banal bullshit. It's far, far nicer. Hikikomori is a Japanese term for extreme social withdrawal, which is actually seen as a mental health crisis in Japan. We have built a world where being alone is equated with suffering, where being by yourself means you must be broken, unwell, or disconnected. The irony is that we've never been more connected and never felt more alone. There is a reason that ancient traditions encourage solitude. It rewires your brain in ways that modern society has completely forgotten. Solitude strengthens your mind. Generic psychologists have found that time spent in solitude actually improves cognitive function. When you remove external noise, your brain doesn't just sit idle, it starts to reorganize itself. It sharpens, it sorts through problems, it makes unexpected connections. This is why so many breakthroughs happen in quiet moments. Einstein would sit for hours in complete silence, letting his mind drift until it landed somewhere new. Nikola Tesla, that guy who was great with electricity and had a powerful moustache, he was the same thing. These weren't men glued to a feed checking updates every 2 minutes, because of course Nokia wasn't around at that point, but they let their thoughts breathe. Solitude also forces self-confrontation. Now, one of the reasons people avoid solitude isn't because it's boring, but because it's frightening. When you are alone, you are left with just yourself, and that's not always a comfortable thing to sit with. Solitude strips away the masks, it leaves you exposed, and that is unnerving if you've spent your whole life distracted, avoiding the deeper questions. The ones like, who am I? What do I actually want? Why do I feel the way that I do? And what if I don't like the answers that I fucking get? But those questions don't go anywhere. You can ignore them, you can drown them out as much as you like, but they don't disappear. They just pile up, waiting for the day when you're finally forced to listen. It's also the key to original thought. Look at history's greatest thinkers, the true visionaries, and you will notice something. They weren't constantly plugged in. They weren't chasing trends, they weren't reacting to every little thing happening in the world. They were alone, and they were thinking. Real insight doesn't come from consuming, it comes from creating space for new ideas, and you don't get that space when you're constantly surrounded by noise. Most people don't have opinions, they have reactions. They think in headlines and comment sections. They parrot ideas they saw online 5 minutes ago, convinced that they've arrived at them independently of their own thought. But when you take the time to be alone, you start to hear something different. You start to think for yourself. And that's dangerous to a world that profits from conformity. Let's be honest, at some point in your life, you've thought about disappearing. Not running away, not buggering off, not escaping, just stepping back. Tuning out the noise, logging off the feed, ghosting the world for a while just to see what's left of you when there's no audience. Because that's the real question, isn't it? Who are you when nobody is watching? And history is full of people who took that question seriously. People who didn't just entertain the idea of solitude, but threw themselves into it like a baptism. Some came back with wisdom, some came back with madness, some never came back at all. They weren't running away from life, they were running towards something deeper, something real. This episode is about them. The monks, the mystics, the madmen. The ones who walked into the silence and let it consume them. Let's start with the monks. Not the shitty Instagram version of monks, not the aesthetic saffron-robed Tibetan mountain meditating latte art and Zen quotes monks. I mean the real ones. The ones who shaved their heads, renounced everything and walked barefoot into the wilderness because they believed the only way to find truth was to lose everything else. The Buddhists got this early. Siddhartha Gautama, before he was the Buddha, was a prince, born into a world of comfort, power, pleasure. He had everything, and yet he felt nothing. Because that's the paradox. The more you have, the less any of it means. So he walked away, left the palace, left his family, took off into the wild and spent 6 years in total isolation, starving himself, punishing his body, stripping away every attachment. And in that emptiness, something clicked. Under a tree, in total silence, after sitting alone for days, he realized the one thing that changed everything. Suffering isn't about pain. It's about clinging to things, to people, to ideas. The way out wasn't more, it was less. And that's when he became the Buddha. From that moment forward, solitude wasn't just a luxury, it was a path, and it spread. Meanwhile, across the world, Christianity was birthing its own solitude junkies. They were called the Desert Fathers. They weren't your soft, candle-lit Sunday sermon Christians. These were men who thought the world was too corrupt, too noisy, and too tainted to find truth in. So they walked into the desert and disappeared. One of them, St. Anthony, spent 20 years alone in an abandoned fort. He literally sealed himself inside, refusing visitors, living on bread that people threw over the walls. When he finally emerged, people thought he'd gone mad. But the twist is that he wasn't broken. He was sharper than ever. They said he had a presence, an aura, like he had seen something they hadn't, because he had. And what started as a handful of radicals in the sand became an entire movement. Monasteries, silent retreats, lives built around the idea that if you want to find God, you have to first remove everything that isn't God. Then we have the mystics. The mystics weren't monks. They weren't running away from the world. They were trying to see through it. And what they found in their solitude didn't always make sense. Take Lao Tzu. He's the shadowy figure behind Taoism, China's most mind-bending philosophy. And the story goes like this. He was an imperial librarian, a bureaucrat, spent his days watching the chaos of human civilization and thinking, this is all bullshit. So one day he leaves, just walks away, gets on an ox and rides west, heading toward total solitude. At the border, a guard stops him, says, hey, before you vanish forever, can you write down what you know? So he does. He sits down and writes 81 verses. And that became the Tao Te Ching, a book so cryptic, so paradoxical, that 2,500 years later, people still can't figure out what the fuck he was trying to say. And then he disappears. No one knows where he went. No one knows if he even existed. Just a name, a whisper, a ghost in the wind. That's mysticism. It's not about answers, it's about questions, not like philosophy. It's about breaking reality apart and looking at the pieces, and sometimes that requires total solitude. Jump forward to medieval Europe. There's this guy, Meister Eckhart, Christian preacher, but when you read his writings, he doesn't sound Christian. It sounds like he dropped acid in a Buddhist monastery. He said things like, to find God, you must let go of God. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. Nothing is truly yours unless you let go of it. And the church, well, they fucking hated this. Because he wasn't saying follow the rules, he was saying break out of the illusion, stop clinging to dogma, find truth in silence, in stillness, in emptiness. The Catholic Church branded him a heretic, quel surprise. He died, probably fortunately, before they could punish him. But his ideas lived. Because the mystics always see something the rest of us don't. But of course, solitude doesn't always lead to enlightenment. Sometimes it leads to madness. And I ask the question, is there a difference between the two? Friedrich Nietzsche spent most of his life alone. He walked the mountains alone, he wrote alone, he thought alone, and he started to see things differently. He saw through morality, through religion, through the comforting lies people tell themselves. And instead of pulling back, he kept going, kept pushing, kept thinking. Until one day, he broke. Collapsed in the street, spent the last 10 years of his life insane, staring into space, barely speaking. He flew too close to the sun. And that's the risk. You go deep enough into solitude and you might not come back. So what's the lesson here? That you should go live in a cave? That you should disappear into the mountains? No. The lesson is this. If you never spend time alone, you will never know what you actually think. Solitude isn't just a retreat, it's a test. It's a test to see what's left when the noise disappears. Some people come back wiser, some people come back seeing things differently, and some don't come back at all. So the question is, are you brave enough to find out which one you are? You ever felt like something's missing? Not like, oh, I forgot my phone at home, but oh, I forgot what it feels like to exist as a human being instead of a node in a network. That kind of missing. Because there's something you lost. Something you had, but it got taken from you before you even knew it was valuable. Solitude. Real, honest-to-God, pure solitude. And before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, another lecture on putting my phone down and touching grass, I need you to understand something. There is a deliberate, calculated war being waged against your ability to be alone. As I said before, this isn't about distraction, it's about control. Because if you can't be alone, you can't think for yourself. And if you can't think for yourself, you can't question anything. And if you can't question anything, then congratulations, you are now a perfectly obedient consumer. That is the war. And right now, we are losing. Let's start with a simple fact. Your attention is the most valuable commodity on the planet. Not oil or gold or real estate or Nvidia stocks. Attention. Because attention is influence. And influence is everything. It's what decides elections. It's what sells products. It's what dictates what you believe is true, what you think is important, what you fear, what you desire. And you know what's bad for business? You sitting alone in a room, thinking for yourself. You disappearing into the woods for a weekend without checking your notifications. You walking around with a quiet mind, unfazed by the hysteria machine. That is the worst case scenario for every social media platform, news outlet, and advertiser on the planet. So they cleverly engineered a system to make sure you never get there. They filled your life with infinite scroll, a never-ending buffet of content because boredom leads to thinking and thinking leads to questioning. They trained you to crave validation. Dopamine hits from the likes, comments and messages so that silence starts to feel like withdrawal. They wired you into the hive mind so that every time you're alone you feel like you're missing out, like something urgent is happening just out of reach. And the most sinister part is they made it feel normal. Of course I check my phone 150 times a day. Of course I wake up and scroll before I even get out of bed. Of course I fill every quiet moment with noise. And once that becomes normal, solitude starts to feel unnatural, like a threat. The system we live in doesn't just tolerate distraction, it requires it. Because a distracted mind is a passive mind. If you want to control people, you don't need to censor them. You don't need to brainwash them. You just need to drown them in so much noise that they stop thinking for themselves. Flood their consciousness with an endless stream of updates, breaking news, memes, outrage cycles, and pop culture drama. Give them so much information that they never stop to ask, well, do I actually care about any of this? And here's the genius part. Make them believe they're informed. Make them think that keeping up with everything is the same as understanding anything. Turn them into reactors instead of thinkers. And the best way to do that is to make sure they're never alone with their thoughts. You see, the war on solitude isn't just about making you distracted, it's about making you controllable, because solitude is dangerous. Not for you, for them. For the systems that run on compliance, for the industries that thrive on keeping you scared, insecure, and addicted. Because here's what happens when you start spending real time alone. You start to think for yourself. No more outsourced opinions, no more parroting whatever the internet told you to believe today. You start hearing your own voice again, and that voice doesn't give a damn about engagement metrics. You see through the bullshit. When you stop consuming for long enough, you realize how much of what you thought was important isn't. Most of the debates, manufactured outrage. Most of the news, designed to keep you anxious. Most of the trends, meaningless distractions. You become harder to manipulate. You stop jumping on every new bandwagon. You stop reacting exactly the way they want you to. You stop being predictable. And an unpredictable person is dangerous, because an unpredictable person is free. The war on solitude is real, but it's not fought with guns or laws or brute force. It's fraught with distractions, with noise, with tiny engineered habits to keep you forever plugged in, forever reacting, forever too busy to notice what's happening to you. And the only way to win is to unplug, step back, reclaim your mind. Because in a world that is trying so hard to make you forget how to be alone, choosing solitude is the most revolutionary thing you can do. Let's start with a hard truth. You have no idea what real solitude feels like. Not being alone, because you've done that, you've sat in empty rooms, you've walked in the woods by yourself. But that's not solitude. That's just being by yourself while still being plugged in. Real solitude, the kind that rebuilds you, the kind that turns you into a different person. You don't get that when you're still orbiting around the gravitational pull of the internet. You don't get that when your brain is constantly tethered to input. Because that's the real trick, isn't it? You're never truly alone if your mind is always occupied with something external. So this section isn't about finding more time to be alone. This is about how to weaponize solitude, how to use it to rewire your brain, rebuild your focus, and take back the part of yourself that's been systematically hijacked by a world that profits off your distraction. There's a reason every major spiritual and philosophical tradition throughout history has emphasized time alone. Because solitude isn't about getting away from people, it's about getting closer to something else. When you are constantly surrounded by noise, it is easy to forget that there is a person underneath all the reaction loops and algorithmic nudges and habitual distractions. So who are you when there's nothing to respond to? Not what do you believe, not what do you like or what you're interested in. Who the fuck are you? Most people will never answer that question because they will never give themselves the silence required to hear the answer. We all know that solitude is the key to original thought. Think about the last time you had a completely original idea. Not a regurgitation of something you read, not an opinion you adopted from the last thing you consumed, but a real, personal, from the depths of your own mind idea. If you can't remember, that's a problem. Because real thinking, deep, raw, creative thinking requires space. It requires an absence of input so your mind can actually generate something new instead of constantly processing what it's been fed. Solitude makes you mentally indestructible. There is a reason monks meditate for hours in total silence. There's a reason warriors in ancient cultures would go off into the wilderness alone before battle. There's a reason every great thinker in history has some version of a solitude ritual. Because when you can be truly alone, you stop being emotionally dependent on the world. You stop needing constant validation. You stop being yanked around by the attention economy. You stop being a predictable, easily manipulated, hyper-reactive consumer. And when you stop being those things, you become dangerous, because you become free. Now we get to the good stuff, the how. Because it's one thing to know that solitude is important, and it's another thing to actually build it into your life like a discipline. This isn't about taking cute little breaks from technology. This is about restructuring your life so you can actually experience what it means to be truly, deeply, mind-expandingly alone. So here's the battle plan. Step 1. Create a sacred hour of solitude, no matter what. Pick an hour. Doesn't matter when, morning, evening, midday lunch break. Just choose an hour where you are completely, absolutely alone. No phone, no laptop, no music, no books, no podcasts, no external input. For 60 minutes, you sit in your own raw consciousness and let your mind do whatever it's going to do. At first, it's going to be uncomfortable. Your brain is going to rebel. You're going to feel like you're wasting time. That's the addiction speaking. Push through. Step 2. Take long walks without your phone. There's a reason Nietzsche, Thoreau, and every philosopher worth remembering swore by long walks in solitude. Because something happens when you move without input. Your brain starts to unravel the knots. You process, you connect ideas, you let your mind breathe. Try it. An hour, no phone, just you and your thoughts. If you feel bored, good. Boredom is where real thinking starts. Step 3. Stop consuming, start creating. Every time you reach for your phone to consume, stop. Instead, Create something. Write, sketch, talk to yourself out loud, process your own thoughts instead of absorbing someone else's. Most people spend their entire lives on input mode, consuming, reacting, absorbing. You want to take back your mind, you flip it. Spend more time creating than consuming. Step 4. Introduce disconnection rituals. You need firm boundaries around your solitude. This means no social media in the mornings, no screens an hour before bed, no aimless scrolling whenever you feel uncomfortable. Set hard rules, because if you don't, you'll default to constant connection, and that's how you lose. Step 5. Rebuild your tolerance for silence. Most people can't handle pure silence anymore. If that's you, fix it. Drive without music or podcasts. Eat meals without background noise. Sit in a room with no distractions for 20 minutes and see what happens. At first, your brain will itch for input, then it'll settle. And once it settles, that's when the good shit happens. Something shifts when you commit to solitude. You stop needing constant validation. You stop craving pointless entertainment. You stop reacting to every dumb thing happening online. Instead, you start seeing things differently. Your mind gets sharper, your thoughts get clearer. Your ability to focus gets stronger than it's ever been. And suddenly, you're no longer part of the herd. You're no longer just another passive consumer. You are someone who owns your own mind. And that makes you powerful. You don't need more stimulation. You don't need more information. You need space. You need silence. You need to remember what it feels like to just exist without constant input. Because solitude isn't a luxury. It's your last line of defense against a world that's trying to steal your mind. So here we are. You've made it to the end, or maybe the beginning. Because if you've been paying attention, really paying attention, then something inside you has already shifted. This wasn't just an episode about solitude. It was an autopsy of your attention, a post-mortem on your ability to think without interference. And now you can't unsee it. You can't unhear the truth. Your mind has been hijacked. And the real question is, what the fuck are you going to do about it? Because if you just listen to this and move on, if you let it get buried under the next wave of notifications and headlines and viral nonsense, then nothing changes. This was just another distraction. But if you're ready to take it seriously, then let's take one last look at what we've uncovered today. Let's pull together everything we've explored so you can make a choice. We started with the lost art of solitude, how the ability to be alone has been systematically stripped from your life. How we've been trained to see silence as a punishment instead of a superpower. We talked about the difference between loneliness, being isolated against your will, and solitude, being alone on purpose, for a purpose. Because solitude isn't something to fear. Solitude is where you find out what you actually think, instead of just absorbing what the world throws at you. It's where you remember what it's like to exist without validation, without reaction, without the constant pull of external input. And it's something you need to take back. Then we dove into monks, mystics, and madmen, a history of those who mastered solitude. We looked at the Buddha, who spent 6 years alone before he cracked the code of human suffering. At the Desert Fathers, who walked into the wilderness and found wisdom waiting in the silence. At Nietzsche, who thought himself into oblivion because he refused to stop asking why. And at Lao Tzu, who just vanished, leaving behind a handful of cryptic verses that people are still trying to decode thousands of years later. The pattern is obvious. The people who have seen the deepest truths, the ones who left behind philosophies and ideas that shaped the world, were the ones who took time to step outside of it. And if you want to think like them, if you want to see the world clearly, then you have to stop drinking from the same polluted shit as everyone else. Then we talked about the war on solitude, the calculated, intentional way modern life is designed to keep you from ever being truly alone. We broke down how the economy of attention is built to make sure you never have an original thought, just an endless cycle of reaction. Because when you can't be alone, you can't think. And when you can't think, you can't question. And when you can't question, that's when you're fucked. We exposed the tactics, the infinite scroll, the monetization of your distraction, the way social media conditions you to fear silence. And once you see the machinery at work, you can't pretend it's not there, because they need you plugged in, they need you engaged, They need you too busy consuming to ever stop and ask, why am I even doing this? And finally, we broke down how to reclaim the power of solitude, the blueprint for fighting back. Create sacred silence. Make time every day where you let your mind breathe, free from external input. Walk without your phone. Stop consuming, start creating. Introduce disconnection rituals and rebuild your tolerance for silence. We laid it all out, and now is the time to test it. This is your moment. If you're serious about taking back your solitude, about reclaiming the part of yourself that has been quietly drowning in noise, then I challenge you to do this. 24 hours. No screens, no internet, no external input. Just you. Sit with yourself. See what happens. See what rises to the surface. Because in the first few hours, you'll feel the withdrawal, the itch to reach for something, anything to fill the space. That's the addiction. Keep going. By hour 6, you'll start to notice the thoughts that usually get drowned out, the ideas, the emotions, the realizations. By hour 12, you'll feel it. The first glimpse of real mental clarity you've had in years. And by hour 24, you'll know. You'll know exactly how much control they had over your mind. And you'll know how much of it you can take back. So if that scares you, good, because that means you need it. Are you going to let this be another fleeting thought? Just another thing you heard, nodded along to, and then forgot the second you opened your phone again? Or are you going to do something different? Because if you don't, then nothing changes. And you stay exactly where they want you. Plugged in, reactive, dependent, endlessly distracted. But if you do, if you take back your solitude, if you reclaim the ability to sit in your own presence without needing an audience, then you join the monks, you join the mystics, you join the madmen, and you start thinking for yourself. Once that happens, you will never see the world the same way again. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for spending your time with me today. Your presence and your attention are deeply appreciated. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast, leaving a review, or sharing it with others who might find it interesting. Your support helps us to continue to bring you this sort of content. Now, as always, if anything in this episode has resonated with you in any way, then I would love to hear from you. You can share your stories on our website at theobservingeye.com, or here comes the huge, big fuck off hypocrisy part, on social media, which I loathe, but we have to use it because it's all part of this marketing bullshit. So you can find us on YouTube, which is youtube.com/@theobservingeye. And we're on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter with the handle @theobservingeye as well. So if you frequent those dens of iniquity, then you're very welcome to come and follow us on there. It's basically snippets of this shit. I've also got an email which I opened up just after the new year, and I thought it'd be an interesting experiment to see if people want to ask me questions or recommend things to cover in future podcasts. So you can send me a message at david@theobservingeye.com, and that's the letter I, not the gelatinous organ through which you see. Remember that bit. So you can send me emails. I answer them myself, and I get back to you as soon as I can, which is generally within a day or so, because I don't get flooded, put it that way. And that's it for today. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.